In 1968, while many blacks were hopefully singing "We Shall Overcome," many whites were secretly worrying about being overcome. Frontlash and backlash were whipping at the country, and charges and countercharges filled the public air. 6 years later, in 1974, the arguments have changed shape. We intend to talk about 74 tonight, but a look at 68 is the starting point. That was the first year in which the majority of whites listened to blacks and tried to determine which black leader to believe.
We've got to turn our back on this country.
Yeah, tell them what to do.
This country has never cared about black people.
That's right.
They don't give two damns about us. And all of us always turn around worrying about what's good for America, what's good later for America, what's good for black people. That's what we want to have.
And of course everybody says, oh, voting is old hat. Legislation is old hat. I don't know what is new hat except revolution. Now, if revolution is what you want, as Samuel Goldwyn said, include me out.
We stand on the eve of a black revolution, brothers. Masses of our people are in the streets. They're fighting tit for tat, tooth for tooth, an eye for an eye and a life for a life. The rebellions that we see are merely dress rehearsals for the revolution that's to come.
I just want to do God's will. And he's allowed me to go up to the mountain. And I've looked over. And I've seen the promised land. I may not get there with you. But I want you to know tonight that we as a people will get to the promised land.
In 1968, it looked as if the non-violent blacks had lost control, and the moderates of each race realized how desperately they were depending on the moderates of the other race. The week after Martin Luther King was killed, there was racial violence in 125 cities across 29 states. During the same period, more than 2,500 fires were set. During the third week in April, there were 21,000 arrests directly related to racial issues. There was fear that if the black movement and the peace movement became allied in action instead of in rhetoric, the United States of America would go into revolution. Anything seemed possible. Firefighters sent into the ghettos were being shot at by snipers. The legitimate protest of the blacks seemed to be debased by the looters who converted frustration into thievery. An inevitable presidential commission was set up to try to find out what was happening between white and black Americans. The conclusion drawn by the commission was that the last Civil War had been fought in vain, that this union, one and indivisible, was gone, that the Pledge of Allegiance to one nation, indivisible, was all finished.
This is our basic conclusion. Our nation is moving toward two societies. One black, one white, separate and unequal.
In April, when blacks burned the Washington ghetto, the federal government lost its nerve. Like some banana republic where the government is not the people and the talk is always of military coups, American troops took up positions around their capital. This may have been one of the most curious political sights of this American century. American soldiers guarding the government against American blacks. Like Louis XVI's troops guarding Versailles in 1789, like the Tsar's Guard holding the Winter Palace in 1917, American troops stood waiting for a revolution that never happened.
The revolution never happened. Why not? Politicians say that wise and far-seeing programs diffused the explosions. Many blacks say that just enough grudging concessions were made to damp down the flames. Others say the blacks had their revolution and lost. In '68, CBS News did a number of surveys and broadcasts called Of Black America. Tonight, we revive that idea in this 2-hour broadcast, because when we look back 6 years, we think we found something that went by unnoticed. Something was going on below the surface that could not be reported on a day-by-day or documentary basis. And yet the movement was there. We measure a different black movement tonight. We measured it with this survey, a half hour of questions given to a scientifically selected group of 2,000 Americans, black and white. You'll hear their conclusions later in this broadcast, as well as a discussion of our report by a distinguished panel. And we measured it unscientifically by following 4 ordinary black families in Kansas City and Atlanta. The Maxwells, the Morgan family, the Reeves family, and Willie Collins and his extended family. 4 portraits in black. We think the combination of poll and portrait leads to something new. We think our report may change the way many white Americans think of black Americans, and may even change the way some black Americans think of themselves.
This is a CBS News special. 4 portraits in black, with CBS News correspondent Hal Walker.
Maybe you've wondered what happened to those black radicals who were arrested in the late 60s. Well, Don Maxwell was busted for taking part in a campus riot some 5 years ago. He wasn't a ringleader or a criminal or anything more than an angry college student. We found him in Kansas City last fall because we wanted to see what the 70s had brought to a 60s militant. 5 years has brought him a wife, 2 kids, and a house. He's split but level, as you'll see. Maxwell's daughter's in daycare. His wife likes the conveniences, and Don's got financial ambitions, along with a couple of jobs. It's easy to think he's a black who's passed from radical to conservative, particularly today when he thinks he needs a bank loan. The only time we heard him tongue-tied was when he tested the water trying to float a loan. Invading a bank's turf isn't easy, even when the man on the other side of the desk is black.
Now, my present location is adequate for right now. The way business is going, I see expanding in the next 2 years. Some of the things, I see some problems with that in that, I know very little about banking, know very little about financing, and, it's not that I'm ready to make any loans, to borrow any money or anything like that, but, I expect to be doing that in the near future.
As far as your borrowing anything, first thing, of course, we'll have to have will be an application from you. Then after the application, and we'll check things out, see where you're coming from, then, of course, we can kind of figure out whether or not we can help you.
In a minor way, the campus radical has become a black capitalist. Repairing chairs isn't his primary job, but at college he learned a bit about upholstery, and he still makes a few extra dollars running a small repair shop.
Hey, man, you want to write this job up? Okay.
Don's uncle has always been an example to him. The uncle is the owner of a prosperous trucking business and the house Don's shop is in, plus several more homes in the area. A well-to-do, independent man who's taught Don a long lesson.
Well, I'll see you tomorrow? Right. Okay. I'll check with you tomorrow afternoon, yeah? Okay, very good. All right.
He's on his way to his main job. Maxwell came out of the Kansas City ghetto, came from a broken home, and his mind is really never very far from those experiences. The Carver Neighborhood Center is where he makes his basic living. Maxwell is the black connection between the social center and the just-better-than-ghetto neighborhood that surrounds it. He's an angry man who's learned to cope with the federal, state, and local bureaucracy.
Some of the work hours, if it's necessary, and only if it's necessary.
But sometimes he reaches into his ghetto background and uses street talk to connect with a teenager who has drug and police problems.
Man, where you at on that drug thing now, man?
I'm trying to stop using that drug, but I still smoke weed and drop pills. I don't mess with that jive, heroin. That's one thing I'm gonna do, stay out them streets, cause I ain't going to nobody's penitentiary.
I had some of the same kind of problem that you had, man. Like, to me, when I was 13, 14 years old, the baddest cat in my community, I lived 3 blocks off 31st Street, at the time 31st Street was really jumping. Yeah. And the baddest cats down there was always the preachers and the pimps. And they always had Cadillac cars, and they always had, bad vines, and to me they were hip,
There's a tough and hard side to Don's character. He's given addicts advice before and seen that advice almost never helps. He's been lied to so many times that he no longer believes many of the promises.
If I can go to school and give me a job, I can't go to work hard, I'll get fired. So that'll slow me down a little bit on that drug thing.
We can make more of an effort than we've been making to try and find you some kind of job. But the job is probably going to be menial unless you get into a training program.
This is Maxwell's day-by-day work, and he's good at it. But social work doesn't pay well, and Don sees no contradiction between working for social gains and being in private business, like real estate. He bought this building, which rents 4 apartments, and he plans on buying several more.
I hadn't received a salary in 6 months on my other job. Our program had run out, and we didn't have any money. And when I was paid in a lump sum. So when I was paid, I just bought a house. If I had been receiving my money on a weekly basis, I wouldn't have saved it. It's just being in the right place at the right time.
What makes you different, then, from the average white capitalist who's out making investments and trying to get what he can?
Well, I really don't know a whole lot about him, and I'd hate to make a generalization about him, but, one of the things, I'm investing in buildings, older buildings, because I can't afford to buy new buildings. And in investing in those old buildings, I'm putting money back into them. All the money that, I really don't realize any profit at this point, because all the money that I receive on rent goes back into the building.
Do you feel any way that you've left the movement? We don't talk about the civil rights movement anymore, but the movement for serious radical change. Have you dropped out of that program?
No. Well, the way I see things now is that I like to see serious radical change occur. But for serious radical change to occur, I think it takes a lot of time, a lot of energy, and I don't think that we're going to have serious radical change or overnight change. So I take things in stride.
What was this area like as a child? How do you remember it?
I think if you kind of just look at the buildings across the street there, it kind of exemplifies what they look like then. They're deteriorated more now than they were then, but they weren't much better than they are now.
Did they call it the ghetto when you were growing up?
No, we just called it the community. We didn't know anything about the ghetto. At least I didn't know anything about the ghetto. I was in college the first time I ever heard the word ghetto mentioned. And I was sitting in a sociology class, and I really couldn't relate to what was happening in the sociology class because I didn't know that they had been studying my community. And the instructor, he had a bad habit of always asking, down in the ghetto, does thus and thus exist? How did you feel about growing up in the ghetto? And I'd sit there like, what's the ghetto, man?
The great lesson the ghetto has learned since 1968 is that pleading is nowhere near as effective as politicking. This meeting is not in the ghetto. A middle-income block group was organized by Maxwell to attack another kind of problem.
We're thinking towards the ice and snow, because everyone in here has slipped in and out, up and down these hills for, I don't know, some more winters than we'd like to think about, under very dangerous situations without the benefit of salt or sand or anything else. And that is something else that we figure we're due that, instead of getting the phones hung up in our face when we call down there and beg for it.
They called the city hall. And I had the number of the supervisor of that department.
Would you give the number out so everybody can write it down and start?
This woman is the block captain, not Maxwell. He showed them how to organize themselves to fight City Hall, and then he stepped back and let them do it. This is the black political frontier, the middle-class problem of organization on the lowest level. And Maxwell isn't talking ghetto black English, but suburban black. He's not telling them the power he has, but the power they have.
The guy that pulls the weight in our neighborhood is our councilman. And we don't use him, and he doesn't see us as a political force yet. And Hasley is a pretty decent guy. He's just busy. But we have to make him understand that we've got problems, and we want him to respond to those problems. Once we get him at a meeting and he sees 30, 40 people there, well, he knows that there's a community organization out here that's really trying to do something, and he knows that's 20, 30, 40 votes, depending on the number of people there. And when he understands the fact that we're organizing block clubs in the whole area, well, that makes him even stand up and look at it even more seriously. We have to really lay it on him thick. And in the meantime, we'll send a letter out with on the Carver Center stationery saying the same thing. We're requesting his presence at the meeting.
It worked. because when last winter's big snowstorm came to Kansas City, the sand and the salt arrived when they were needed. City Hall was called, and City Hall listened because there was enough political clout to get the snow moved. This isn't where Don lives. It's a higher income neighborhood. Don's home is in a more modest section where his real estate holdings have expanded. He owns 2 of these houses, his aunt owns a 3rd, and he has his eye on a 4th.
That's right.
Property and family turn militants into moderates. But the Maxwell family has never disconnected from the ghetto.
What'd you do with it?
Dolores Maxwell never lived in a ghetto, but what attracts her about her husband is the drive, the push itself that the slums gave him.
I know my husband, now he does have to prove himself. You know, that's just him. That's his way. He always wants to be number one, which is good. You know, and the way he was raised up, you wouldn't think that he's gotten as far as he has. You know, there was just something behind him that, you know, kind of pushed him to do what he's done.
Whatever it was that pushed her husband, she wants that for her son, too.
I feel kind of good when I look at Donald, you know, and see, like, he grew up, you know, in a poor family, and his parents were divorced, you know, and, well, he kind of grew up on the streets, you know, and I want him to have an education, too, but I also want him to know about life, but I want him to be a man. I want him to be able to stand up on his own 2 feet, you know, and take the blows if he gets in and come on back up with them, because I see a lot of black little boys that I teach, you know, their parents give them everything, you know, and they can't stand up on their own. I think black men really have to kind of stand for it in order to make it.
College women take lessons from Don Maxwell. He's learned political organization, he's learned how the welfare system works, and he's learned to take care of himself, his finances, and family. None of it is secondhand. The old militancy is in his voice when he tells them about family life in the ghetto.
Because it's just as hard raising kids, as far as I'm concerned, as it is being a community organizer. And any of you ladies that have kids, you know, it's not an easy job to raise kids. And when somebody hires you to raise their kids, and you have to let yours go, and yours are living in the heart of the ghetto, and they got all kinds of things that they can get involved in, but you got to be out here raising this lady's kids, fixing this lady's dinner, and you go home and your kids don't get no dinner, they get some hot dogs, and you be so tired from putting in all that time with that lady's kids until when you get home to your kids, damn it, what are you doing? Sit down, quit making, and you start to holler and scream, and you develop a funny kind of relationship with your own kids. And your kids feel, well, mama don't care, and mama's so tired, she comes in, she falls out, and she goes to sleep until the next morning she has to start that drudge all over again, until the kids are allowed to do some things that they wouldn't ordinarily be able to do. So they say in the ghetto, you got a bad situation in the ghetto because those kids are doing all kinds of things. They into prostitution. They into having illegitimate children. They into killing folks. They into robbing. They into stealing. You know, and so you really just got a social problem. And what we have to do is be sensitive and understanding of why people do things. And even, you know, like I'm not saying that just white folk are insensitive. Black folk are insensitive too. A lot of black folk, they forget from whence they came. See, and they should be about the business of trying to understand, because most black people, they were in the same position a few years ago. And most white people have some relatives that are poor too. But all black people got relatives that are poor.
To our minds, at least, the major unrecognized drama in black America is the movement from poverty and slums into middle-income country. This small step may be what put out those 68 fires. Don Maxwell came from a broken family and built a solid family, taught himself to be a father and husband, left college but went back and got his degree, and moved from poverty to comfort. Nowhere near as exciting as a riot or a burning is the move into middle-income America, but this is what black Americans are achieving more than ever before.
Don Maxwell, at 27, is not the typical middle-income black. In earnings and in education, he is above the norm. But Maxwell's trip out of the ghetto is no longer exceptional. In his lifetime, there has been a major shift in the earning levels of black families. When he was born, only 1 in 10 black families earned more than $7,000 a year. Today, about 1 in 2 earn more than that. The black families we studied make between $7,000 and $25,000 a year. Their median income is $11,400. That is hardly affluence. With today's inflation, it may soon be little more than subsistence. But it is a boundary between dependence and independence. Once the great mass of blacks lived in poverty. Far too many of them still do. but they are no longer a majority. This change was taking place all through the explosive 60s. In our study tonight, we're concentrating on black families like the Maxwells, families who have crossed into middle income, a story almost totally overlooked, even though they are half of all blacks. It may look as if we're saying the battle is over. Well, it isn't. For one thing, all the while that black income was rising, white was going up even faster. In 1951, black family income was about $3,000 behind white. In 1971, black families were about $4,000 behind whites. In other words, improvement by no means implies equality. And in spite of everything, almost 1/3 of black families are still below the low-income level. The proportion of black families in this situation has been declining, but it is still more than 4 times as high as it is for whites. The difficulty is that there are 2 different pictures of black America that can be drawn today, and both are accurate. You can take a picture of those who have not benefited from the progress of these years, and there are plenty of them. The other involves the gainers, and those are quite real too. But we don't mean by that the spectacular cases that are usually brought out on these occasions, the only black surgeon in the hospital, or the black architect, or the black vice president of a corporation. We mean the ordinary blacks who have made their way up from the bottom. No one of them is exceptional, but their total story is. Because in the last 2 decades, black families have entered the mainstream of American life in larger numbers than ever before in our history. Let me say again the most important thing we found in all our research. Half of all black families have moved from dependence and poverty to independence and middle income. And in a moment, we'll show you how some other families did it. Morgan is one among 130,000 blacks who work for the United States Postal Field Service. Blacks make up nearly 1/5 its workforce. Morgan is in special delivery. He works out of the main post office in Atlanta. His wife, Dorothy Morgan. She's a clerk in the State Motor Vehicle Bureau in Atlanta. Over 800,000 black women do clerical work. Clerical work is the second largest category of black female employment after service work. Unlike their jobs, the Morgan home is a rarity, because not one black family in 100 owns a home this new or this far from the inner city. Even for that tiny percentage, there is usually some special reason. The signs tell the story. Any one of them means a house is for sale, but a whole crop of them means a neighborhood is for sale. In real estate talk, it's called a transitional situation. In straight talk, that means it's on its way from white to black. That's why the Morgans got a good deal on the price of their house. They had lived in public-supported low-income housing, and then they pulled out of here and moved into here. Even though they were not the first blacks in the area, they didn't expect a big welcome in their new home, and they didn't get one.
Well, really, when we moved in, we didn't see any neighbors. You know, it was a long time before we saw the people next door. And wasn't any bringing out chocolate cake and all that stuff.
Anytime a black family moves into a white community, it automatically becomes transitional to some degree.
I was driving up here, a whole bunch of for sale signs. How do you feel when you look at these we're running away kind of signs day after day?
Well, I think it's rather silly for whites to move out of a neighborhood when they see blacks moving in. I think it's real silly.
I mean, it's really sad in this day and time for somebody to jump up and move solely because I move in next door to them. I mean, you know, that's really saying that you think a hell of a lot of me. That's really saying that you think I got a heck of a lot going. You know, that you're really fighting and moving away from me. Does it hurt?
It hurts a little.
You know, really, does it hurt you? Yeah, it ought to, because it's telling you that, you know, we aren't too far beyond where we started. You know, we're still running.
Would you be shocked, or would you argue with me if I characterized you, as both of you, as a part of the new black middle class?
I don't believe too much in that. But if you want to talk about middle class, no, I'm not even approaching the middle class.
I'm not in the lower class, so I must be in the middle class. I'm not in the upper class. So I guess we are middle class.
How's it feel?
Feels great. I feel like I've been middle class all my life. I mean, I didn't just become middle class.
There's a whole movement around women who want to work and express themselves in terms of their liberation. Is this a part of the thing that's on your mind when you go out to work?
I'm just making a few bucks for the family.
But getting those bucks for the family involves a lot more than just Dorothy Morgan's working. The household has to be organized all day without the parents being present. There's no money for daycare or babysitters, so here's how it's done. Father is up first. He's already set things up, turned on the switches, put out the equipment. Then he has a cup of coffee and sets off for the post office. Meanwhile, Mother has taken over the cooking, and the oldest girls have been helping the younger children get washed and dressed. Now here they come, all stomach. Mother finishes the cooking. She does some of the hard cleaning up, and then she changes into the working woman. Now comes the final switch that makes it all work. Mother and Father have gone out the door, but authority hasn't gone with them. It just moves over to the oldest children. Breakfast is served, and the day's routine goes forward with Bridget and Tony in charge. What's interesting about this is that it's a very old black custom. It's called role sharing, and it began back when black fathers were forcibly taken from their families, and black mothers spent the day working in the fields. The system still goes on in the suburbs. It works pretty well, unless one of the children has troubles. Of course, older children can't substitute for adult guidance. But if the mother didn't work, the Morgan family wouldn't be living this well. With both parents working, we estimate the Morgan income to be a few $1,000s a year above the black median level. The key has been Dorothy's salary.
With us, blacks, it's no big thing for the wife to work. I mean, this is the way it's been, and this is just not on the low economic level. It's all the way up the ladder from the bottom to the top.
If Dorothy's job is key to the Morgan standard of living, it's also symbolic of that great unnoticed change as millions of black families moved into middle-income America. They get there because the black woman works more often than the white woman works. The only place where this change has been officially noted is in a document recently published by the Bureau of Census. Quote, "There was no apparent difference between the incomes of white and Negro husband-wife families outside the South where the head was under 35 years old." Unquote. In other words, in one small area of American life, under 35, outside the South, with husband and wife working, blacks are doing just as well or better than whites.
Okay, I found sure this 68-4 is titled to Robert K.
Dorothy likes her job. There may have been no chocolate cake from her neighbors when she moved into her new home, but it's a little different at the office.
Everybody's real friendly, and when the birthdays come up, instead of going out for lunch, we'll fix, each one of us fix something, to bring for the party. And at lunchtime, we'll fix our plates and take them in the snack bar and eat whites and black. And it's just like a family. Everybody's real friendly and everybody's close.
The push
push of middle-income blacks into suburban turf may be tomorrow's territorial conflict, but today a black suburban homeowner is a rare fellow. Blacks make up only 5% of the suburbs, and as homeowners, they're outnumbered 30 to 1. Whatever that is, it's not integration. Like whites, blacks are discovering green is beautiful. Green is a tranquilizer from the abrasions of the city. People don't move into suburbs because they want to be nearer their neighbor. Distance is a suburbanite's most treasured possession. What controls distance is zoning. Local control of zoning is what the suburbs are all about. Rezoning is a fighting word. No sooner had the Morgans arrived than they got themselves in a middle-class zoning fight.
What happened to us was that some otherwise nice people approached us about using the house next door, which hasn't been sold yet, and somehow it developed into where they wanted to put a radio station in. And here comes the old cliche, the thing of black, like white neighborhood going black, and the minute that happens, and here comes the rezoning signs, and like from residential to business, or partially business, and it moves me to the extent that we went out and carried a petition to some of the neighbors to see what their thinking would be on it, and naturally, they feel pretty much the same as I do. No businesses. This has been a fairly decently kept neighborhood for years now, when it was white. Nobody thought about coming in and putting radio stations or businesses of any kind. And I don't think it's fair, for them to try to do it now. And what happened is, this was just last week, and incidentally, we went down to the Cobb County Commission, and they were very sympathetic. In fact, the committee recommended that the commission deny granting this rezoning thing here. So we won. You got a lot of blacks out here in the Cobb now, and particularly Southwest DeKalb. I think Southwest DeKalb is attempting to go totally black, I believe. I don't know.
The blackening of DeKalb County puts Prince Morgan out on the social frontier. The whites may flee totally, which seems likely, or the zoning may give way and undercut the very reason he sacrificed so much to live out here. What the 1970s will see, far more than the 1960s, is the use of zoning as economic discrimination. The Morgan House is a long way from the old problems. The decay and despair of the ghetto have been left behind. But nature abhors a vacuum. So do real estate brokers. Prince Morgan beat back the first attempt at debasing the neighborhood, but someone else is sure to try.
8 kids, one $30,000 home. Yearly income just over $11,000. When the Kerner Commission reported that America was becoming 2 nations, they had it wrong. It's black America that's dividing into 2 nations, separate and unequal. One black American nation has a father present, a mother working, and is entering the middle of the greater America. But the other black America is poverty country, and the data show that poverty is related to family structure.
When the Kerner Report was written in 1968, almost 3 out of 10 black families were headed by women. The figure for white families was 1 out of 10. Today, the white figure is about the same, but the black figure has risen to more than 3 out of 10. These are critical numbers because a family without an adult working male almost always has severe economic problems. For blacks, the average family headed by a woman earns a little under $4,000 a year. The average black family headed by a man has an income of $9,000 a year. The gap between them is over $5,000. More than half of black families headed by women live in poverty, and more than half of them receive public assistance. School dropout rates, delinquency, drug use, and crime are at their highest in these fatherless families. Yet to blame them for their condition is to condemn the victims for the crime. They are the product of many factors, some as old as a brand of slavery that forcibly broke up black families. Some newer, like unemployment being twice as high for black men as it is for white men, or public assistance laws that penalize a family when the man is living in the home. But at the end of all the arguments is the fact that there are now 1.5 million American black families headed by women, and 1 million of them live in poverty. Neither the growth of our economy nor complicated aid programs have reduced their numbers. Kansas City's Country Club Plaza is an early example of a good shopping center. The idea was build the shopping area and then people will buy homes around it. The idea worked. There's another new idea at work at the Sears store that fronts on the shopping center. The idea is Greg Reeves, a blackface at the weekly staff meeting. He's about to take a short but significant trip.
Today we're proud to have a representative from our shoe department, Mr. Greg Reeves, our Division 15 manager, to tell us a little bit about the fine winter shoe. So, Greg, you have the floor, partner.
Partner he's not, manager he is. The trip from one side of the podium to the other, from being trained by whites to teaching whites, that trip is maybe the longest voyage a black American will ever take.
A couple of Saturdays ago, I had the boss, Gunderson, Interlead, a couple other staff members, my men down on the floor, kicking around in a pair of these. Everybody probably wondered, they're probably just walking around in an ordinary pair of tennis shoes, as people kind of refer to them as. But this is not a tennis shoe. This is the winner.
Greg's fellow workers take him for granted, and Reeves is up there making his pitch easily.
Come on down to see us, and we'll fix you up with a pair. We got them for not only you, but we've got them for the kids. They're from size 3.5 to size 12. So I figure we can fit Gunderson back there. We can fit anybody.
Greg Reeves is not the house nigger. During the time of the riots, many large American firms hired their first blacks nervously and put them up front where they could be seen. But since then, firms like Sears have had a good record in the employment and training of blacks. There's still no cause for celebration. Nationally, only 2% of black men are in sales, and less than 1% have managerial jobs. Nevertheless, as Greg walks his floor, it's only a few feet until he meets another black employee.
No, we can't do that.
White Americans expect to be served by blacks. What they may not expect is black ambition. We asked Reeves where he hopes to be in 10 years.
10 years, still with the company, hopefully off in merchandising where I'd like to be, or even higher in management, higher position. I feel like opportunities are pretty good.
Do you think the opportunities are pretty good because you are black, or in spite of the fact that you're black?
You know, it could be a combination of both, because, how times are changing.
What do you think the goals and aspirations are of members of the black middle class?
Materialistic things, of course, the average white has. Everyone wants that. Position in the community as far as recognition, respect, things like that, and just to be treated equal, as one should be.
Mrs. Reeves wants her fair share of America, too.
I work because I want some of the better things for my family and for myself. And I know I wouldn't be able to get them. I could have the necessities if I didn't work. But, I want more than that. I want more for myself, more for my child and my family. Wear better clothes, have a nicer house, and a car. I want to own a few things.
She knows that it's tougher for black men than for black women.
Because they're going to have a little bit more than the white man to get in there in the first place. That's bad, but that's just the way it is.
Someone once said that the definition of the middle class is that it plans ahead. The poor can't plan ahead, and the rich don't have to. Beverly is a planner. She has a day as organized as an airline schedule. She knows just where she wants to touch down in a few years. Right now, Beverly has to take care of her home, her 3-year-old's education, her own education, and a job. So both Reeves women are on their way to school. But the schools are 20 miles apart. Beverly will be teaching somebody else's children for money and experience, while somebody else will be teaching her child. Kelly Reeves is dropped off at the Palestine Baptist Church, where a daycare group looks after her. The whole plan would fall apart if there weren't a daycare center. It would also fall apart if there weren't a grandmother to pick up Kelly later and take the child to the grandmother's home. Beverly's afternoon stop is at a local elementary school where she's a teacher's aide. She gets paid for this. She needs the money, but it's part of the bigger goal of becoming a specialized teacher.
What degree are you working toward now?
I'm working toward a degree in elementary education, but later on I'd like to specialize in special ed.
Special education? I mean, gifted children and or retarded children?
Retarded, slow, problem children.
What takes you into that field? Why have you developed that interest?
I really don't exactly know how, but in working with children, I always seem to get stuck with the one that's the most problem, and I like it.
Today I'd like to turn to a new theory, to a new theorist, B.F. Skinner.
Beverly's morning was spent in another classroom, aiming toward that degree she'll need in order to teach, in order to make the money she wants, in order to fulfill herself. A lot of black women are doing the same thing, maybe 250,000 of them. In 5 years, the number of black women in college has nearly doubled. Beverly pays part of her tuition. The rest comes from grants and loans. There's a pattern of inequality in American society which extends to educated black women compared to educated black men. The figures show that if you compare black women and white women with 4 years of college, they have about the same earning power. But if you take a black man with 4 years of college, you'll find that he earns about as much as a white man with 4 years of high school. What makes Beverly run is not what she learned at school, but what she learned helping her mother clean up a white woman's home on weekends.
Every Saturday, my mother and I used to go and do this domestic work at this lady's house. She didn't have a real big house or anything, but it was really nice, and I admired the house. But I just could not see myself doing that every day. And the thing of it was is so that I could have some extra money, So, I felt like I should work. And then my mother always did the hardest part anyway, and here I was doing the easy part, and I felt disgusted. So I felt like that was a good experience for me to show my mother, for my mother to show me some of the things that she had been through, that she had been telling me about. Well, I don't want you to have to do this, So, I think things like that are good. If you're exposed to something, well, then that's better than somebody just telling you. That'll give you determination, too. And you just have, a lot of times, I think, if you have determination and a little help from somebody who's interested, you can do just about anything you want.
When you're in your mid-20s and in mid-income in middle America, possessions start to fold around you like the leaves in a head of lettuce. It's an American article of faith that learning to play the piano must be good for kids. And Kelly's first piano lesson is not a B-flat blues, but, as you'd expect with her mother, a C scale with classic fingering. Not that the Reeves haven't been exposed to black consciousness. Kelly gets her lessons in black culture from the very air around her and from Soul Train on television. There's no strain going from Soul Train to choir practice. Some of the optimism of Greg and Beverly Reeves is simply that of the young. After all, they were scarcely out of the cradle when federal troops stood around the schoolhouse in Little Rock. And they were only teenagers when Martin Luther King was shot. This accounts for some of it, but not all. If they seem full of faith and hope, it's not entirely without reason. In our CBS News survey, we investigated both black and white attitudes toward work. One question was, if by chance you had enough money to live comfortably without working, would you most likely work anyway, or would you do something else? More than half of both races say they would work whether they had to or not. We asked the same question another way. Which kind of job would you actually take? One with average pay for work you didn't like, or one with less pay for work you enjoyed? Here, blacks and whites had opposite responses. More than half the blacks said they would take average pay for work they didn't particularly like. Only 36% of whites made that choice. On the other hand, over half the whites said they would take less pay for work they enjoyed, but only 35% of blacks made that choice. In 1968 and 1973, we put the question of discrimination directly. We asked, Which do you think is the main reason blacks have not made more progress? Discrimination against them because of their race, or because they have not worked very hard at the opportunities available to them? In both 68 and 73, the two races had exactly opposite opinions. In 1968, almost 7 out of 10 blacks thought that the reason they had not made progress was because of discrimination. Only about 1 in 5 whites agreed. In 1973, neither race had changed its opinion substantially. In 1968, more than 7 out of 10 whites thought it was because blacks had not worked hard enough. Only 33% of blacks agreed. And in 1973, both opinions stayed about the same. In other words, despite everything that's happened in the last 5 years, the overwhelming majority of whites continue to believe that blacks don't work hard enough, and the vast majority of blacks believe they are discriminated against. Willie Collins, 54 years old, works the night shift out of the Kansas City post office. He's worked with his hands all his life. This is a civil service job, very low on the ladder, and the way Mr. Collins got the job has to do with handouts and power. Almost 5 years ago, he met a guy who knew a guy. They were both very white and very nice, and very interested in helping a nice 49-year-old black boy along.
Mr. Arnold come out, and he met me, and says, "You Willie?" I said, "Yeah, well, Dr. Pollard called me. And, come on in." And I went on in, and he said, "Well, just formality, just go ahead and fill out the application, you know what I mean, and leave it there." And he called Damas, one of his foremen, and says, "Put this man to work." You know, just as simple as that. So it was permanent, so I took it.
Permanent is a 1930s word, and for a man Willie's age, being permanent is better than being middle class. During the Depression, permanent meant you could exist. It's always the Depression for an unskilled black man, always the 30s. This kind of job is known to civil servants as a sleep job. Not that Willie sleeps, but with this kind of work, you can keep your mind on something else.
Charles, go in your room and get your clothes on.
Minnie Collins has been married to Willie for 25 years. Once she worked in the kitchen of a hospital, once in a takeout restaurant. Ernest Collins is trying to decide about going to college. Willie Jr., age 16, is in high school. Altogether, there are 7 sons. 2 are married and living in their own homes. 1 is in the Air Force, stationed in the Philippines. The family came out of poverty, and because of Willie, they're securely in middle income.
Charles, are you all ready?
It wasn't so secure 20 years ago when Minnie and Willie came up north from Mississippi. Willie tried St. Louis and couldn't make ends meet.
You want to get on apple jelly out in the backyard.
Minnie and the kids went back to Mississippi, and Willie tried it once more in Kansas City. If he hadn't made it, the family might have broken up. But Willie did, and the family stayed together. Willie arrives home from the post office at 7:45 in the morning. Most of the family has exploded out to school or work, and Minnie's on her way, too.
I guess I better go. I'm running late now.
Okay, I'll call you.
Just finished filming the day today. That is a question the whole world wants to know. We blame it on this.
Willie has his second cup of coffee and watches that second cup of coffee television that's neither annoying nor interesting.
Mothers who fret over daughters who pet think the same thing in their It isn't the lipstick, the cocktail, the jazz. It's some girls you happen to fall.
But this isn't the end of Mr. Collins' day. Some people have moonlight jobs. Collins has a sunlight job to go to. His son Ernest goes along with him. A long time back, Willie discovered the way into comfort was a second job. The second job he went into required an outlay of money. So on a salary of $45 a week, he saved $5.
I said, well, I'm going to have to figure out a way to increase this. Well, we started saving $5 a week out at 45, and I got me a car, and I bought me a lawnmower, and I went out to talk to this lady one day, and she says, yeah, I said, you can do my yard, and I'll get you some more. So she talked to the lady next door that same day, and that was 2. And by the time I come back to do those 2, she had me 3 more. Just went on and on until I had to get me another lawnmower and increase my equipment. And pretty soon I had to have me a trailer, and then she got me some more.
A man's character is his fate, said the Greeks, and that's how they educated their children. The Romans educated their children to become leaders. Willie never studied Greek nor Latin, and being the man he is, he wouldn't think much of either definition. You go to school and educate yourself so you don't have to work with your hands all your life, so the opportunities are better for advancement. It's a middle-class American idea without coloration that was virtually unchallenged until recently. Willie's given the same speech to his 3 eldest sons without much success. And now he's trying the Protestant middle-class work ethic on earnest.
Yeah, well, you got to suffer for anything that's good if you get it. You can't get something for nothing. You got to pay something for it. In other words, if it's time, you got to spend that. I think I still probably will want to go to college, maybe in a year or 2. Yeah, but you see, if you just sacrifice for the next 4 or 5 years, and you're in, you do anything you want to do. You don't have to borrow nothing. You know, anything come up that you think you might be interested in, you can take it. But you have to prepare yourself. Yeah, that's one of the things that I never wanted to happen to you is to miss school. I want you to put every day in school you can. I wish I had the opportunity that you have. I believe I really could have been somebody.
Minnie is a high school dropout who decided to drop back in, some 7 sons and 27 years later. She's up to 400 words a minute in a speed reading class. She's already taken her high school equivalency degree.
Keep up with that.
Mrs. Collins wants to be a librarian. Now she's at Penn Valley College with 22 credits towards her Bachelor of Science degree.
I really wanted to be a social worker, but when I got in this program, they told me you have to have at least 2 years of college, and I didn't have any college, so I had to accept what they had to offer. I hear now you have to have 4 years of college to be a social worker. I really wanted to work with people and, get out and meet people.
Pull it out, look at it there, not pull it clear out, let's take a look at it.
I would like to read you a couple of stories this morning. How many of you would like to hear a story this morning?
Me.
Mrs. Collins runs the local branch of the library. It's reading time, and though her job is primarily clerical, she takes the reading hour.
Well, you read along with me here, and we'll look at some pictures, too.
I want to read all them.
The name of this book is Animals Should Definitely Not Wear Clothing. Because a camel might wear it in the wrong place. See what a camel is wearing his hat?
He's wearing it in the wrong place.
In the wrong place.
I would never do that if I was a horse.
Minnie told us she doesn't think she does this job very well, but anyone who can read and who's had 7 kids can handle telling stories. Minnie, like Willie, always has her eye on the next job.
I like working with the children. They talk to me about, some of them doesn't like to go to school, and I try to talk to them and tell them about, where they should go to school and what they will need it. That would be very embarrassing.
It won't be for me.
The teenagers come in the library or drop out, and I tell them my life story. And you know, how I quit school and stuff like that, and sometimes it helps.
With what the business brings in, and with Minnie's salary and Willie's salary, the Collins family is doing pretty well. But there's a cost, and it's more Willie who's paying it than Minnie.
Been prepared for the nursing of my part, for Christ's sake. All right, boys, dig in.
We figure Willie came into this Sunday dinner with about 6 hours sleep in the last 48.
I never wanted to go away. That's the way to do it. Eat all this. What'd you say, Carlos? Hey, you can't talk. You can't talk. Can't talk and can't walk.
That's Otis, the eldest son, with Carlos, a grandchild.
Hey, Linda, give him a little time. Okay. Smell something. I don't know what it is. I don't know what it is. You see my car out there, don't you? Oh, what kind of car? It's 63 Chevy. Oh, that's that white one over there. Yeah, that's all right. Got a paint job on it. $34.95.
Love and discipline ricochet almost unnoticed around this room. Willie, the father, is obeying that deep instinct that bursts inside a man when he reaches his 50s. The instinct to pass on what he knows. Otis is in a union and on a construction job. Willie never got Otis to college, but in Willie's mind, the next best thing to permanent is a good union job.
My ambition was to try to get on construction where the big money was, you know. But I kept going to these places, going, and they'd always give you some excuse. And I went down one day and I said, well, what is the deal? How come they won't hire? He said, well, I'm gonna tell you. He said, our union just won't hire black. He called him, and I talked to him, and he said they hadn't got it open yet, but they was working on it.
What kind of union was that? What kind of union?
Well, the union for construction. I don't know what local it was, but
you don't know what trade it was. Whether they was a carpenter.
They were labor.
Labor.
Yeah, labor.
Locked out. Willie was locked out of the union. He didn't want to be a specialist. He wasn't asking for a chance to work in a skilled trade. It wasn't the boss who wouldn't hire him. It was the working class union that locked out a willing working man. This was the place where the door was always open to Willie. All the white men knew about the black church was the music that drifted outside. Inside, the blacks put together health, education, and welfare before the government ever thought about it. They weren't called labor unions, but mutual aid societies. The budgets were tiny, but the idea was large. Come together, not only for prayer, but to help the sick, bury the dead, instruct the young. When the schools were closed to them, preachers taught young blacks to read. When government was closed to them, the church taught them how to organize for survival. The idea was to make them Christians, but in the book they were given, the story they took most to heart took place almost 2,000 years before Jesus. Exodus was a scene they instantly recognized as their own. Therefore, they set taskmasters over them to afflict them with heavy burdens. So they made the people serve with rigor and made their lives bitter with hard service in mortar and brick and in all kinds of work in the fields. Home to Willie is Mississippi. Last Thanksgiving, he went back.
This is the only place I know about, you know, and this is where I live. This is my home, and I look forward to next Thanksgiving when I leave here this time, to coming back here.
In the 1920s, when Willie was born, almost one black worker in 2 was in farming. Now it's 1 in 40. About 5 million blacks have left the South entirely just since 1940. Before the mechanical cotton picker took over, Minnie used to pick cotton. She stooped, she carried 50 pounds at a time, she was all day in the fields. A little woman with no desire to go back.
My father was here, and all of my sisters and brothers were gone. And he was trying to work, his farm. And just the 2 of us. And I was just working him to death. And when it ended up, nobody had anything. But I know at Christmas time, Daddy would end up having to borrow some money sometime for Christmas. We didn't even have money after we worked all the year. We didn't even have money, for Christmas.
Yet Mississippi's home. This is where the roots are. Minnie's mother and father. Mr. Barber served in the United States Army in Europe in World War I. You can go home again. You can go back to where it started, to a place where it's good to be. Willie's mother. She's lost 2 legs to diabetes. She used to be a midwife, and people would come with mules and wagons with their pregnant women. Or she'd walk through Tallahatchie County, Mississippi, and deliver babies on cold nights in Black America.
The week after Martin Luther King was killed, there was racial violence in 125 cities across 29 states. During the same period, more than 2,500 fires were set. During the 3rd week in April, there were 21,000 arrests directly related to racial issues. There was fear that if the black movement and the peace movement became allied in action instead of in rhetoric, the United States of America would go into revolution. Anything seemed possible. Firefighters sent into the ghettos were being shot at by snipers. The legitimate protest of the blacks seemed to be debased by the looters who converted frustration into thievery. An inevitable presidential commission was set up to try to find out what was happening between white and black Americans. The conclusion drawn by the commission was that the last Civil War had been fought in vain, that this Union, one and indivisible, was gone, that the Pledge of Allegiance to one nation, indivisible, was all finished.
This is our basic conclusion. Our nation is moving toward 2 societies, one black, one white, separate and unequal.
In April, when blacks burned the Washington ghetto, the federal government lost its nerve. Like some banana republic where the government is not the people and the talk is always of military coups, American troops took up positions around their capital. This may have been one of the most curious political sights of this American century. American soldiers guarding the government against American blacks. Like Louis XVI's troops guarding Versailles in 1789, like the Tsar's Guard holding the Winter Palace in 1917, American troops stood waiting for a revolution that never happened.
The revolution never happened. Why not? Politicians say that wise and far-seeing programs diffused the explosions. Many blacks say that just enough grudging concessions were made to damp down the flames. Others
black who's passed from radical to conservative, particularly today when he thinks he needs a bank loan. The only time we heard him tongue-tied was when he tested the water trying to float a loan. Invading a bank's turf isn't easy, even when the man on the other side of the desk is black.
Now, my present location is adequate for right now. The way business is going, I see expanding in the next 2 years. Some of the things, I see some problems with that, and I know very little about banking, know very little about financing, and it's not that I'm ready to make any loans, borrow any money or anything like that, but I expect to be doing that in the near future.
As far far as your barring anything, first thing, of course, we'll have to have will be an application from you. Then after the application, and we'll check things out, see where you're coming from. Then, of course, we can kind of figure out whether or not we can help you.
In a minor way, the campus radical has become a black capitalist. Repairing chairs isn't his primary job, but at college he learned a bit about upholstery, and he still makes a few extra dollars running a small repair shop.
Hey, man, you want to write this job up? Okay.
Don's uncle has always been an example to him. The uncle is the owner of a prosperous trucking business and the house Don's shop is in, plus several more homes in the area. A well-to-do, independent man who's taught Don a long lesson.
Well, I'll see you tomorrow? Right. Okay. I'll check with you tomorrow afternoon, yeah? Okay, very good. All right.
He's on his way to his main job. Maxwell came out of the Kansas City ghetto, came from a broken home, and his mind is really never very far from those experiences. The Carver Neighborhood Center is where he makes his basic living. Maxwell is the black connection between the social center and the just-better-than-ghetto neighborhood that surrounds it. He's an angry man who's learned to cope with the federal, state, and local bureaucracy.
Some of the work hours, if it's necessary, and only if it's necessary.
But sometimes he reaches into his ghetto background and uses street talk to connect with a teenager.
The blacks had their revolution and lost. In '68, CBS News did a number of surveys and broadcasts called Of Black America. Tonight, we revive that idea in this 2-hour broadcast. Because when we look back 6 years, we think we found something that went by unnoticed. Something was going on below the surface that could not be reported on a day-by-day or documentary basis. And yet the movement was there. We measure a different black movement tonight. We measured it with this survey, a half hour of questions given to a scientifically selected group of 2,000 Americans, black and white. You'll hear their conclusions later in this broadcast, as well as a discussion of our report by a distinguished panel. And we measured it unscientifically by following 4 ordinary black families in Kansas City and Atlanta. The Maxwells, the Morgan family, the Reeves family, and Willie Collins and his extended family. 4 portraits in black. We think the combination of poll and portrait leads to something new. We think our report may change the way many white Americans think of black Americans, and may even change the way some black Americans think of themselves.
This is a CBS News special. 4 portraits in black, with CBS News correspondent Hal Walker.
Maybe you've wondered what happened to those black radicals who were arrested in the late 60s. Well, Don Maxwell was busted for taking part in a campus riot some 5 years ago. He wasn't a ringleader or a criminal or anything more than an angry college student. We found him in Kansas City last fall because we wanted to see what the 70s had brought to a 60s militant. 5 years has brought him a wife, 2 kids, and a house. He's split but level, as you'll see. Maxwell's daughter's in daycare. His wife likes the conveniences, and Don's got financial ambitions, along with a couple of jobs. It's easy to think he's a... In 1968, while many blacks were hopefully singing "We Shall Overcome," many whites were secretly worrying about being overcome. Frontlash and backlash were whipping at the country, and charges and countercharges filled the public air. 6 years later, in 1974, the arguments have changed shape. We intend to talk about 74 tonight, but a look at 68 is the starting point. That was the first year in which the majority of whites listened to blacks and tried to determine which black leader to believe.
We've got to turn our back on this country.
Yeah, tell them what to do.
This country has never cared about black people.
That's right.
They don't give 2 damns about it. And all of us always turn around worrying about what's good for America, what's good later for America, what's good for black people. That's what we want.
And of course everybody says, oh, voting is old hat. Legislation is old hat. I don't know what is new hat except revolution. Now, if revolution is what you want, as Samuel Goldwyn said, include me out.
We stand on the eve of a black revolution, brothers. Masses of our people are in the streets. They're fighting tit for tat, tooth for tooth, an eye for an eye and a life for a life. The rebellions that we see are merely dress rehearsals for the revolution that's to come.
I just want to do God's will. And he's allowed me to go up to the mountain. And I've looked over and I've seen the promised land. I may not get there with you, but I want you to know tonight that we as a people will get to the promised land.
In 1968, it looked as if the non-violent blacks had lost control, and the moderates of each race realized how desperately they were depending on the moderates of the other, who has drug and police problems.
Hey, man, where you at on that drug thing now, man?
I'm trying to stop using that drug, but I still smoke weed and drop pills. You know, I don't mess with that jive, heroin. That's one thing I'm gonna do, stay out them streets, because I ain't going to nobody's penitentiary.
I had somewhat of the same kind of problem that you had, man. Like, to me, when I was like 13, 14 years old, the baddest cat in my community, I lived 3 blocks off 31st Street, you know. At the time, 31st Street was really jumping.
Yeah.
And like, the baddest cats down there was always the preachers and the pimps. And they always had Cadillac cars, and they always had, you know, bad vines, and to me, they were hip, you know.
There's a tough and hard side to Don's character. He's given addicts advice before and seen that advice almost never helps. He's been lied to so many times that he no longer believes many of the promises.
If I can go to school and get me a job, I can't go to work hard, you know, I get fired. So that'll slow me down a little bit on that drug thing.
We can make more of an effort than we've been making to try and find you some kind of job. But the job is probably going to be menial unless you get into a training program.
This is Maxwell's day-by-day work, and he's good at it. But social work doesn't pay well, and Don sees no contradiction between working for social gains and being in private business, like real estate. He bought this building, which rents 4 apartments, and he plans on buying several more.
I hadn't received a salary in 6 months on my other job. Our program had run out, and we didn't have any money. And when I was paid in a lump sum. So when I was paid, I just bought a house. If I'd been receiving my money on a weekly basis, you know, I wouldn't have saved it. It's just being in the right place at the right time.
What makes you different, then, from the average white capitalist who's out making investments and trying to get what he can?
Well, I really don't know a whole lot about him, and I hate to make a generalization about him, but, you know, like, one of the things, I'm investing in buildings, older buildings, because I can't afford to buy new buildings. And in